The call came at 2:47 in the morning, and Serena Mack almost didn't answer it. She was 3 hours into a double shift at St. Ambrose Memorial, her sneakers squeaking against linoleum that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, when her personal cell buzzed against her hip. Unknown number. She silenced it without looking up from the chart in her hands. Room 412, Mr. Patterson, post-op vitals trending the wrong direction, and didn't think about it again until the same number called back 4 minutes later. Then a 5th time. She stepped into the supply closet between the crash cart and the IV bags and picked up Miss Mack. The voice on the other end was low, accented, unhurried in the way that men with power are never in a hurry. "Don't hang up," she almost did. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "Someone who knows your brother owes us $400,000, and someone who knows you're the only person in his life who's ever been able to talk sense into him." The supply closet suddenly felt very small. Serena Mack was 29 years old. She had put herself through nursing school on student loans and waitressing tips. She drove a 2016 Honda with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat permanently occupied by a reusable grocery bag and a copy of Tabor's Cyclopedic Medical Dictionary. She did not know people who called at 2:47 in the morning about $400,000. Her brother did. She had known that eventually, in the dull, nauseating way you know a storm is coming when the air pressure drops and the birds go quiet. Dominic had been sliding for 2 years. The vague excuses, the borrowed money he swore he'd return, the new friends whose names she was never given. She had told herself it wasn't what she thought it was. She had told herself that 3 times a week, the way people tell themselves things they know aren't true. The voice on the phone told her to come to an address in the garment district at 7 the next morning if she wanted her brother to come home with all the fingers he'd left the house with. She wrote down the address on the back of a patient intake form. She finished her shift. The building didn't look like anything. That was the point, she understood later. 7 stories of grey concrete wedged between a dry cleaner and a parking garage. No signage. A single camera above the door, angled precisely to cover every approach. A man in a dark coat was waiting on the sidewalk when she arrived. He didn't introduce himself. He looked at her badge. St. Ambrose Memorial, RN, still clipped to her scrubs because she hadn't thought to take it off, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly like a door opening a crack. He said, "Come alone," the man said, "I am alone." He looked past her at the street. Satisfied, he held the door. The elevator smelled of leather and something cool and expensive she couldn't name. Serena stood with her hands clasped in front of her, and her heart doing something irregular that her nursing brain catalogued as sinus tachycardia, situationally appropriate, self-resolving, do not treat. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. The number above the elevator door climbed to 6. The doors opened into a room that should not have existed inside that building. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced west, and the morning light came in flat and grey over the city skyline, turning everything in the room silver. There was a long table, chairs, a bar along one wall that was almost certainly never used for casual drinking. 3 men stood near the windows. 2 of them were the kind of large that made the room feel smaller. The third was standing slightly apart, his back to her, looking at the city like he was trying to decide something about it. He turned when she stepped off the elevator. Serena had expected something different. She wasn't sure what. Something louder, something that announced itself. What she got was a man in his late 30s, dark jacket, no tie. The kind of tired around the eyes that isn't from one bad night, but from years of keeping things running that weren't supposed to run. He looked at her badge first, the same way the man downstairs had, then at her face. "You're Dominic's sister," he said. "Where is he?" "Sit down, Miss Mack, I'd rather stand." Something crossed his face. Not anger, more like recalibration, the way a doctor looks when a patient's response doesn't match the expected presentation. He pulled out a chair across from him and sat down himself, which forced her to make a choice. Keep standing and perform the defiance she didn't actually feel, or sit and have a real conversation about her brother's life. She sat. His name, she learned in the next 4 minutes, was Voss. Not a first name, just Voss, said the way a city is named, like it had always existed and needed no further explanation. He ran things in 3 boroughs and parts of a 4th. Dominic had borrowed money from a man who borrowed money from a man who ultimately answered to Voss. The amount had grown. Dominic had stopped returning calls. 2 weeks ago, he had done something considerably more stupid than not returning calls, and now the situation had moved from a financial inconvenience to a matter of credibility. "I'm not a bank," Serena said. "I'm a nurse. I don't have $400,000. "I know what you have," Voss said. He said it without condescension, which almost made it worse. "I'm not asking you for money." "Then what are you asking me for?" He looked at her for a moment. Outside, a siren moved through the street somewhere far below them. Rose faded. "One of my men was brought into St. Ambrose 2 nights ago," he said. "Gunshot wound to the abdomen." He gave a false name. He checked himself out at 4 in the morning, 12 hours after surgery, against every piece of medical advice in the building. A pause. "He's currently in a great deal of pain, running a fever of 103, and refusing to let anyone near him." Serena stared at him. "You want me to treat him? I want you to keep him alive." "I'm not a doctor." "No," Voss said. "But you were the nurse on his ward that night. You know his chart. You know what he needs. And you're here at 7 in the morning when you just finished a 12-hour shift, which tells me that when you decide something matters, you don't stop until it's handled." The silence in the room was different from the silences she knew. Not the silence of a waiting room, not the silence of a corridor at 4 a.m. This was the silence of men who were accustomed to waiting for answers and did not particularly mind how long it took. "And if I do this," she said carefully, "Dominic, we'll discuss the terms of his situation. That's not an answer." "No," Voss agreed. "It isn't." He was watching her with an expression she would have called respect if she'd been willing to give him that much credit. She wasn't, not yet, but she noticed it, filed it somewhere in the back of her mind with the other data points she was already unconsciously assembling. The way the 2 large men by the windows hadn't moved once, the way Voss hadn't raised his voice or made a single explicit threat, the way he'd mentioned her badge twice without making it feel like surveillance. "I need to see the chart," she said. "The real one from the hospital, not whatever you have." "It's already printed." Of course it was. "I need supplies. Specific ones. I'm going to write you a list, and I need everything on it, not approximations." She pulled her pen from her scrub pocket, a habit so ingrained she'd done it without thinking, and reached for the notepad on the table. "And I need to know how the wound actually happened, not the version he told the attending." Voss looked at her for another moment. Then, for the first time, something in his expression moved. A small shift around the mouth, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of something unexpected. "Agreed," he said. She wrote the list without looking up. Saline, betadine, fresh dressings, specific antibiotics she named by drug class and dosage, suture kit, sterile gloves in a size that would actually fit her hands. She wrote quickly, in the compressed notation of someone accustomed to shift handoffs, and when she finished, she pushed the notepad across the table. One of the men by the window came forward and took it. "The fever," she said. "How long?" "Since yesterday morning." "Is he lucid?" Intermittently, she stood and put her pen back in her pocket. "Then we need to go now." His name was Theo. He was 34 years old, according to the chart. And he was running 103.8. When Serena arrived in the back room of an apartment in Midtown that had been converted, somewhat impressively, into something approaching a medical space. Not a hospital, nowhere near a hospital, but better than most of what she'd expected. Clean surfaces, adequate light. Someone had been trying. Theo himself was less cooperative than the room. He opened one eye when she walked in, clocked the badge on her chest and the supply bag she'd been given at the door, and said, "I don't need a nurse." "You have sepsis," Serena said pleasantly, setting the bag down on the table. "You need a hospital. Since you've apparently decided you're not going to one, you get me, open your shirt." He didn't move. She didn't stop moving, snapping on gloves, checking the supplies against her list, uncapping the saline. "Mister, Theo. She used the honorific deliberately, calmly, the voice she used with patients who were scared and performing not scared. I've been awake for 19 hours. I drove here directly from a 12-hour shift. I am going to look at that wound, and I am going to tell you what's happening inside your body, and then you can make an informed decision. But I need you to open your shirt. Something shifted in his expression. He reached for his buttons. The wound was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. The surgery had been clean. The attending at St. Ambrose had done good work. But the early discharge had interrupted what should have been a controlled recovery. There was redness spreading at the margins, heat. The beginning of what her fingers told her was localized fluid accumulation before it became something systemic and catastrophic. She worked without speaking for a while, cleaned the site, changed the dressings, assessed. Behind her, she was aware of Voss in the doorway. She had heard him follow them in, had decided not to comment on it. "You need IV antibiotics," she said finally. "I can manage with oral for the next 8 hours, but after that the fever needs to come down more reliably than pills are going to accomplish. That means a line. Can you handle a line?" Theo looked at the ceiling. "Do what you need to do." She did. It took 40 minutes. She worked the way she always worked, efficiently, narrating quietly as she went. The habit of a nurse who'd learned early that patients tolerate procedures better when they're not surprised by them. Theo said nothing until she was taping down the line and then, abruptly, "How'd you end up doing this?" She glanced up. He was watching her with clearer eyes than he'd had 20 minutes ago. The fever was already responding. "Your boss called me at 2:47 this morning," she said. "Before that," she considered, "nursing school. Before that, my mother was sick for a long time and somebody had to know what the doctors were saying." He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something. "He doesn't ask for things he can't pay for," Theo said. "In case you were wondering—" "I was," she admitted. "He'll take care of your brother." "He hasn't said that." "He brought you here," Theo said. "That's him saying it." She came back the next day, and the day after. She told herself it was medical responsibility. An undertreated infection required monitoring. And she had initiated the treatment, which meant she bore some ethical obligation to see it through. She was a nurse. She didn't abandon patients. This was true. It was also not the whole truth, and she was honest enough with herself, in quiet moments, to know it. The apartment became familiar in the way places do when you return to them under circumstances that require full attention. Every detail sharpened by adrenaline, by the strangeness of the situation, until the particular slant of afternoon light through the west window, and the sound of the street 6 floors below, became things she recognized without thinking. Voss was there on the second day. Not hovering, he was working, papers spread across the long table in the main room, 2 phones, a conversation happening in another language she half recognized as Eastern European but couldn't place. He paused the conversation when she came in. "How is he?" "Fever's down to 101. The antibiotics are working. He needs to stay horizontal for at least another 72 hours, which I understand is not something you can make him do, but I'm passing along the medical recommendation." "I'll tell him. He won't listen." "No," Voss agreed, "but I'll tell him." She went to check on Theo. When she came back through the main room 40 minutes later, the other conversation was gone, and Voss was standing at the window with a coffee he hadn't drunk. "Your brother," he said without turning around. "He's not going to be able to pay what he owes." Serena stopped. "I know that," she said. "He knows it too. He's been running because he knows it." Voss turned. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I am not telling you this to frighten you. All right." The man Dominic borrowed from initially, the chain that eventually reaches me. That man has his own problems with a group of people who are not interested in payment plans or extensions. In 3 weeks, there's going to be a conversation in this city that will settle a number of debts and arrangements, and your brother's situation will be discussed in that conversation. He held her gaze steadily. "I can make sure it's discussed favorably, or I can let it go where it's going." The floor felt solid under her feet. She focused on that. "What do you want?" she said, Nothing you haven't already been giving. He said it simply, without theatre. Theo gets better. He attends that meeting with me in 3 weeks. You make that happen. He needs more than 3 weeks. 2.5, then. I'm not negotiating against myself, Miss Mac. I'm telling you what I need, and I'm telling you that I'm good for what I'm offering. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the city went about its business 27 floors below, completely indifferent. I want it in writing, she said. The silence lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Then, all right. Theo improved steadily, in the incremental way of bodies returning to themselves. 1 degree of fever, then another, then appetite, then irritability, which Serena had long ago learned to treat as a positive clinical sign. Irritable patients were patients with enough energy to be irritable. She would take irritable over quiet and compliant every time. She began to understand, over those 2.5 weeks, the architecture of the world she'd stepped into. Not because anyone explained it to her, but because she had been paying attention to sick people and their people for 6 years, and sick people's people always revealed more than they intended to. The way men deferred to Voss without being told to. The way Voss moved through decisions, quickly, finally, without the backward glance of someone uncertain of his authority. The way Theo talked about him, which was the way people talk about people who have, at some point, done something that earned loyalty beyond simple employment. She didn't trust any of them. She was also not afraid of them, or not afraid in the way she had been at 2:47 in the morning, with her heart loud in the supply closet. Fear, she had learned from years of bad nights on the ward, is most powerful when the thing producing it is still formless. Once you can see it clearly, diagnose it, assess it, make a plan, it becomes something manageable. She could see this clearly now. On the 16th day, Theo sat up in bed, ate an actual meal, and told her she was the most stubborn person he'd ever been treated by, which he delivered as a compliment. She believed him. On the 18th day, she arrived to find Dominic there. He was sitting in the main room with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking the way he'd looked at 17 when their mother caught him in a lie, hollowed out by shame, too exhausted for the performance of contrition. He stood when she came in. "Seri, don't," she said, not unkindly. Just finally. She sat down across from him and looked at her brother, 26 years old, and so much younger than that, and she made herself look at him without the stories she'd been telling herself. Without the version where this was a phase, where he'd find his way back, where the boy who had once sat beside their mother's bed reading out loud because the hospital was too quiet was still the whole of who he was. He was still in there. She could see that too. "You almost got yourself killed," she said. "I know. Not almost." Voss used the word will, as in, this will happen. Dominic looked at his coffee. "How did you handle it?" "He doesn't do deals." "I didn't do a deal, I did a job." She paused. "I kept someone alive." Her brother was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'm sorry, I know you are," she leaned forward. "Dominic, listen to me very carefully. Whatever Voss tells you to do to settle this, you do it. Not halfway. Not mostly. You do exactly what he says, and you don't take any more side arrangements with anyone, and you call me before you make any financial decisions for the next 2 years. Do you understand me? He's going to want me to work for him. Then you work for him." "Seri, these are not good people." She looked at her brother. She thought about 19 days, about a fever she'd brought down by degrees, about a document she'd asked for and received, about what Theo had said on the first day. He doesn't ask for things he can't pay for. "I know what they are," she said. "I also know that you're alive and you're sitting here, and that's not nothing, Dominic. That is not nothing." The meeting was on a Thursday. Serena wasn't there for it. She was at St. Ambrose, room 308, managing a post-surgical complication that kept her occupied from 6 in the morning until well past noon. She didn't know what was decided in the room where the debts were settled. She didn't ask. What she knew, Dominic called her at 2:15 that afternoon. She missed the call. Her hands were sterile, and he left a voicemail that was 11 seconds long and said only, "It's done. I'm okay, thank you." She played it twice in the break room. standing at the coffee machine, and then she put her phone back in her pocket and went back to work. 3 days later, Voss called, not at 2:47 in the morning. At 6 in the evening, like a reasonable person, or a person making the effort to approximate one. She was in the parking garage at St. Ambrose, keys in hand, bone-tired in the way that had its own particular texture after a long shift. "Theo's cleared by his doctor," Voss said. "Officially. He went in today." "Good," she said. "He should continue the oral antibiotics for another 10 days. I'll tell him." "He won't." "No." A pause. "Miss Mack, what you did, I want to be clear that it isn't something I'll forget." She unlocked her car, stood with the door open, the garage cold and smelling of exhaust. "I did my job," she said. "Yes," Voss said, "that's what I mean." She didn't know what to do with that. She wasn't sure she was supposed to do anything with it. She got into her car and put her forehead briefly against the steering wheel. Not from distress, but from a kind of tiredness that needed somewhere to go. And then she sat up and started the engine. Her phone showed 3 notifications, a reminder about a dentist appointment she needed to reschedule, a message from her building about the parking lot being repaved, and a bank notification, an amount deposited to her account that was not her direct deposit, an amount that cleared her student loans entirely, with enough remaining to replace the car she was sitting in. She sat in the parking garage for a long time. Then she drove home through a city that looked the same as it always had. Same streets, same lights cycling red to green, same people moving through the dark with their particular urgencies. And she understood, without being able to fully articulate it yet, that she had learned something in the last 3 weeks that nursing school hadn't taught her. That the most dangerous thing a person can bring into a room full of power is quiet competence, offered without performance, in the service of someone who needed it. She had walked into that room at 7 in the morning with a pen in her pocket and a list of supplies she would not compromise on, and she had done what she was trained to do. And somewhere in the doing of it, she had changed the terms of a situation that had not been hers to begin with. The city moved around her on all sides. Serena Mack drove home and did not look back.